Hi, this is Patrick Nelson with Chiron.
Patrick, this is Rob Goss with Ice Miller. I think we're in the waiting room.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, Patrick. Audra Ferguson, Ice Miller's on too.
Hi, this is Janet Crana from Chiron, also in the waiting room.
Hi, Janet. Good to hear from you.
Yeah, good to hear from you, Audra. How you doing?
Good. Did your house make it through okay?
Yes, thankfully, everything was fine with the hurricane, so I was very lucky.
I'm glad to hear that.
Hang on. Can they hear me on the? Okay. All right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, everyone. Great to see you today, and I look forward to talking with you about a variety of topics, and we should have plenty of time for that. As we start, let me make sure and do a quick roll call for some of those who are joining us on by phone to participate. I heard them speaking as we were all getting started, but I just want to make sure. So if you will, if you're on the phone, I want to call your name, just answer here or present. So we have Janet with Chiron,
Here?
Cassie with GRS,
Here.
Audra with Ice Miller,
Here.
and Rob with Ice Miller.
Yes, here.
All right, that's who all we were expecting. Are there any other participants that I did not call your name that's on the phone?
Patrick Nelson with Chiron.
All right. Anyone else? All right, sounds good. So, Mr. Chairman, if it's all right with you, we'll go ahead and get started. Everything seemed to be working properly with the technology. So we have a variety of topics to go through today. The first area that we'd like to start with is following up on the additional actuarial reports, the 2 additional independent actuarial assessments, as you know, that we went over in the last meeting, the draft reports, and in the stack you have a copy of both of those reports, very similar to last time. There have been no material changes to either the GRS report or the Chiron report, except for the main difference and the main update being adding in the fiscal impact per employer. You may remember that was an aspect in the legislation that passed that indicated that these 2 additional independent actuarial assessments needed to include the fiscal impact. And so we've had them add that, and it's toward the back. Like I said, we'll do GRS first, which is toward the back of the report in an appendix. I think it starts around page 26 if you want to take a look at that. And it's listing out the employers. And what I asked them to do was to take the information and, based on their actuarially determined contribution, their ADEC, compare that to the current contribution and to estimate the fiscal impact per employer. And I'm going to talk more about that in a summary form and aggregate form in just a few minutes, but that's the main difference to the report. If you move the Chiron reports, the same thing. It too has fiscal impact by agency toward the back in an appendix, and I believe it starts on, let's see, page 27, and same advice to them. And they're a little different, but very similar in method and very similar in the amounts, and you can see that there. They are both on the phone. I don't anticipate many questions since there aren't many changes, but they're both on the phone should you have any. But if not, at the proper time, I would ask for the board to approve/accept these 2 additional reports. I word it that way, however you prefer, but it's not that you're necessarily approving any of the recommendations in there just yet, but we do want to acknowledge and accept the reports to finalize them so we can have a record of that in the minutes that the board had these studies completed. So I'd like to ask for your motion or approval to accept the two additional actuary reports from both GRS and Chiron.
You heard the staff recommendation to accept the reports, the two additional actuaries.
And second.
We have a motion and a second. Any discussion? Questions? If not, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries.
Thank you. And the next item is to do essentially the same thing for the regular and more routine annual evaluation and projection report from CAVMAC. You recall receiving that prior to the last meeting and going over that information with Kavanaugh McDonald. In the same stack, you have a packet of the final report here. Very similar to last time. There haven't been any material changes since the draft was provided and presented prior to or during the October meeting. So with that, of course, Ed Coble is here. Should you have any questions, same for me, but I would like to ask for the board to accept this report as well, just to have, so we have it in the record.
Does CAVMAC have?
Something here that we've calculated I'm about to go through, but Kavanaugh McDonald just did their report as usual, essentially, and the law referenced the other two independent actuarial analysis, so that's why it's in theirs. Of course, I'm sure they'd be happy to do it if we ask them, but it's not in there, no, sir.
And in the next part, Ray, were you planning on going over also I think what was a little bit of a, it isn't necessarily this fiscal impact, which was legislative, but more of contribution, risk, and what potentials there could be for measurement of that with CAVMAC? I know you and I discussed that at some point, but is that part of what could be in your discussion next, or is that appropriate here?
Yes, absolutely. Of course, whichever you prefer. I had it envisioned a little bit later in the meeting,
Okay.
but we definitely are
That'll
going
be
to
fine.
talk through demographic risk and contribution rate.
Okay. Just didn't want it to be the end of it as far as that goes, because I think that was something that one of the senators brought
That's right.
up.
That's right.
And there's something to that. It's just a question of whether that could be calculated or not, and how that may be done in other plans, so.
That's right. And there is a little bit of that in this report in the sensitivity analysis section about contribution rate risk and demographic type risk. But we were planning on going over that in more detail a little bit later this morning.
Okay.
If agreed.
So this is the same except for CAVMAC and the acceptance of their report as presented. Do we have a second?
Second.
Have a motion and a second. Any questions? Other questions? Comments? All those in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Motion carries.
All right, thank you. And I'm going to ask Devetta Lee, Ms. Devetta Lee, if she'll come up. And we have a short fiduciary training and update from our outside counsel with Ice Miller. And Ms. Lee's going to drive the PowerPoint here, and Audra and Rob, as you heard, are both on by phone. But thought we would do a quick refresher and update on fiduciary duty and the fiduciary roles. We need to do that from time to time. This is a shorter version, estimated to be around 15 minutes or so, plus some questions or confirmations. But thought it may be good in the context of the dialogue and the recommendations and so on and so forth over the last year or two, and plus what's coming today and over the next 6 months to a year. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ms. Lee and then Ice Miller on the phone. And Ice Miller, you know, we often think of them as tax counsel, which they are, but also as fiduciary counsel, because they do a lot of fiduciary work with others throughout the country. And of course, we have Ms. Lee as well as Ms. Caroline Johnson with the AG's office. But today we have Audra and Rob, and so I'm going to turn it over to you.
Ray, we normally in board meetings, we do approval of the agenda. Is there a need to do that before?
Let's do that. I think that was actually on the agenda. I was working through from my mental outline, I guess, but
So
yeah.
my apologies.
Yeah.
And we'll go back.
To approve.
And,
Second.
all right. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Thank you very much.
Thank you, and my apology as well.
Yeah, now we want to go back through the reports.
I think, unless she tells me otherwise, I think we'll be all right. All right, go ahead, Audra and Rob.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Higgins, for that introduction. And Devetta, we'll go ahead and start on slide number 2. Mr. Higgins mentioned this is a very shortened version of our presentation, just intended to be a refresher, but we're happy to answer any questions as they come up. So first and foremost, you'll hear us talk about the trust. So who really are the parties, the main parties to the trust that we're talking about? And first, you'll hear us refer to the settlor, and that's the state of Mississippi and the legislature. And we'll talk a little bit more about the settlor responsibilities and the role, but importantly, the settlor is not a fiduciary. Then there are, of course, the trustees, set forth under Mississippi Code 25-11-101, which provides that all funds of the system shall be held in trust in the custody of the Board of Trustees.
As Audra said, there are 2 ways an individual can become a fiduciary. One is by function, and that is that the actions that the individual takes makes them a fiduciary because of their role in administrative or investment decisions under the plan. And the other is by designation. Audra, are you back?
Rob, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Oh, okay. I could hear you guys the whole time. I'm sorry about that. So by function is if they have the authority to make any discretionary administrative or investment decisions related to the retirement plan. And here the key is just having the authority. So it's not that anybody has to act. Okay. I do want to touch on real quick on slide 4, who is not a fiduciary. And so it's important employers are not fiduciaries, meaning cities and counties. And if you go back to the definition of a fiduciary, cities and counties and the employers in general do not have the authority to bind the plan. They do make reporting to the plan, reporting compensation, reporting employees, but they are not fiduciaries. So they do not have the same role or responsibility as the trustees. So slide 6. Typical settlor responsibilities, again, that's the state or legislature, is deciding to offer a retirement plan. That's a settlor decision. Choosing the type of plan, so whether it be a defined benefit plan, a defined contribution plan, a 457B plan, those would be settlor decisions. Plan design, and then discretionary plan amendments. So optional plan amendments is also a settlor responsibility. So with that, I will turn it over to Rob.
Thank you, Audra. Devetta, next slide. From a high level, we're going to talk about the 3 primary fiduciary duties: the duty of loyalty, the duty of prudence, and the duty to follow the plan documents. Next slide, Devetta. Each of the duties comes with sub-duties, and here we've listed the sub-duties for the duty of loyalty. The first being the duty to act solely in the interests of the participants and beneficiaries, which is slightly different than the next duty to act for the exclusive purpose of providing benefits and paying reasonable plan expenses. Again, these both interrelate, and they go back to the statutory and with care, skill, prudence, and diligence that a prudent person would exercise in managing their own affairs. Under the Turney versus Marion County Board of Education case, your duty is actually a little higher because it requires prudence as in the general prudent person of discretion and intelligence in like matters. So that's slightly higher than what's important is that you used your prudence in making the initial decision, that you monitored that decision, and that you documented the process by which you made the original decision and you monitored that decision. Next slide, Devetta, please. And then both of these duties work together. We see this in claims that can be made against trustees, that you can make a claim under both duties. But here under the Mississippi Code, we wanted to note for you that you have an obligation to make recommendations for amendments to the articles under the plan as you deem proper. And then we know from the discussion with the actuarial firms earlier that you have a new obligation where you're making recommendations for changes to the plan, and that those changes be supported by, especially with regard to contributions, be supported by 2 different outside actuarial firms from your own actuarial firm. And Audra, with that, I'll turn it back to you.
Yeah, and on that slide too, you know, making the recommendations, we just want to emphasize those recommendations are done in consideration of the duty of loyalty and prudence. And it may be necessary to make certain recommendations to preserve the financial integrity and long-term sustainability of the system. But all of that must be done in consideration of the exclusive benefit rule and what's in the best interest of all members and beneficiaries as well. And then the last duty is the duty to follow the plan document. It can also be difficult in practice in that the terms of the plan document have to be followed. And if they're not followed, then there's an obligation on behalf of the fiduciaries to make corrections, to recover overpayments in certain circumstances, and make sure that the plan is amended as necessary to be in compliance with federal law. So with that, we have enacted certain divestiture laws, so telling the pension system they must divest certain investments. And so that can create some tension because the Board of Trustees has a fiduciary obligation to maximize returns for the best interest, but the legislature does not have that same responsibility. So that's where there is some tension in the different roles, given that the settlor is not a fiduciary.
So the bottom line is the legislature really has the final say so on what we do.
Well, it certainly does. Audra, I was just going to say it certainly does, as outlined in the statutes which create the plan terms. So they have the final say in increasing contribution rates, for instance, or in making changes to the plan. But you have the final say in interpretation matters as outlined in the plan terms.
I'm still a little confused on who's got the final say-so. Some of you who've been on longer than I have may want to speak to that.
Whose responsibility is it to update the plan? The legislature created it, and it's been given to us. Are we the ones that update it and then it becomes binding on the legislature, or does the legislature update the plan and it become binding on the fiduciaries?
Well, I'll speak a little bit. Go ahead, Audra, Rob, go ahead.
No, I was actually going to say, certainly we would defer to Mr. Higgins and Ms. Lee on the distribution of powers with respect to that question.
Well, I think on both of these questions, it really depends. Going back to Commissioner Dale's question, well, I'll come back to that. To yours, Dr. McCoy, I think it depends. But no doubt, the legislature designs the benefits in law, and they created and delegated the authority to PERS and to the Board of Trustees in law. So in that respect, they determine what the law is. At the same time, when it comes to administering the plan and making the decisions or implementing and interpreting the law, then that would be the PERS Board of Trustees. I hope that's helpful, and Audra and Rob can jump in there more if we need to. Going back to Commissioner Dale, I think in the context of the last couple of years, and perhaps the next year, and what they were saying. I think we were just trying to point out that, going back to that slide about the parties of the trust, you have the beneficiaries, which is all the membership, you have the settler or the sponsor, which is the state, and then you have the trustees, which is the board, the fiduciaries. And I think what they're trying to point out is, when it comes to, back to your question on who has the final say, it depends. If it's about designing the plan, well, ultimately, for the most part, with the exception of something that is our fiduciary role, the legislature is going to have the final say most of the time. But to specify in this context, when it comes to designing the plan and designing the benefits, that's the legislature. When it comes to carrying out your fiduciary duty, then that's you all as a board of trustees. If, for example, in the law, it has to do with setting assumptions or interpreting the plan. So it really depends. I think the purpose here was just to point out everybody's role and who is a fiduciary or not. For example, as you and me, as you and I, and we are fiduciaries, we have that duty and loyalty to the membership. We don't necessarily have that duty and loyalty to the state budget, or to a city's budget. And whereas the legislature has to consider all those factors, but they don't have that fiduciary duty to the trust like you do and like I do. Hope that helps a little.
And when it comes to the recommendations, those of you who've been here for a while, we've made many recommendations, Chairman Reed. Many have been technical corrections when there's an issue of interpreting the law. What do we do? How do we apply this? Maybe it's not clear. But prior to me being here, Mr. Benson, even in tier design, the board has been involved in discussing those matters and making recommendations with the lawmaker. So the board has always been involved in making recommendations, but as he said, it's in the statute. So they put the plan design in the law via statute. So that happens at the settler.
Well, my whole purpose in asking this, I don't really, as we were last year, but I was not very well pleased with the fact that an effort was made to fire me from this board. Did not sit real well.
The fiduciaries are responsible for dispersing funds and making sure that the benefits are paid. What happens when there's not enough funds for us to achieve our fiduciary responsibilities? Can we legally be held responsible because we cannot make those payments?
Well, certainly a long way from that, and
I understand. I'm just saying, in the future, can I legally be held responsible for not making a payment of which I am in charge of doing as a fiduciary for this fund?
Sure. No, great question. And as I referred to Audra, then let me just say, as you know, we're a long way from that, and certainly hope that's not the case and work together to prevent that. But great question. And Audra and Rob, you want to answer that?
Yeah, we haven't seen that happen in the country yet, thankfully. We have seen and been involved with some systems that were not well funded, and we see fiduciaries take action to make recommendations for new tiers. But there is, as a fiduciary, you do have an obligation to your members and beneficiaries. And so we have seen boards threaten to, I'm not condoning this, but you're asking the question. So we have seen boards in discussions with potentially suing the state for contributions, because as the settler, it is the settler's responsibility to make those contributions to the fund. Not the fiduciary's responsibility, but it is the fiduciary's responsibility to ensure the best interest of the members and beneficiaries, and that the terms of the plan, including the benefits that have been promised, are paid. Rob?
Yeah, I would just also add, I mean, your question also gets at what is your personal liability exposure for your work as a fiduciary, as a trustee. And for that, we would defer to your AG and to Ms. Lee and Mr. Higgins, because state law would set forth what the scope of your protections are and what you can be personally liable for. Certainly, as a fiduciary, you're not liable for funding of the system. your responsibilities go to maintaining and administering the funds that you've received.
Well, that definitely needs to be clarified, because in another life, when we took over an insurance company, we went after not only the officers, but the boards of directors and anybody associated with it had liability. So I want to be sure, as Dr. McCoy says, that we've got some protection from that happening. I don't foresee us ever going broke anytime soon, not as long as I'm on the board. I'll be dead by then, but there's a good question.
Yeah, Commissioner, I think that's the point in this is, as a fiduciary, where are you gonna be sitting in court, somebody defending you or not? Those duties of a fiduciary is the purpose of this. The legislature has their own, as the settler, as a person on this board in your capacity.
And will want to staff and will be funded. Does a fiduciary have any responsibility or role in recommendations for employment packages for future participants?
Sure, great question. I have a few thoughts on that, but I think if it's agreeable, we'll ask Audra and Rob, since this is during your presentation segment, to comment on that.
Yes, and I think that's Dr. McCoy speaking. And that's a great question. As fiduciaries, you do not have a fiduciary responsibility for individuals who are not part of the pension plan currently. And you have to be careful about your fiduciary role is to the trust. So as you sit on the board as a trustee, you don't have an obligation to ensure that schools in the future have teachers available in the future to support the education of the students in the state of Mississippi. Your role is to the trust fund. And so that's why there can be pretty sweeping and significant changes to new members, and that doesn't run afoul of your fiduciary duties because they're not current members to the trust. Rob?
No, and I think we've even talked about this before, though it's been a couple of years. Certainly in other systems that have been faced with financial pressures, they've made recommendations to the legislature on reforms related to the benefits as it relates to potentially bringing on a new tier or changing the terms for a new tier as in the exercise of their fiduciary duty of maintaining the sustainability of the plan for current members and beneficiaries.
So the plan document is pretty vague here. Is that constitution? Is that statute? Is that regulation? Is that all of those things?
Basically all of the above.
Okay.
Yeah. Which of course the ones that apply most here, well, certainly the board regulations, but is in the context of benefits and things that we're talking about, a lot of that's in statute, and that would be part of the plan document.
See that far, my left, your left on the screen. You can see statutes, rules, procedures, policies.
So it's not really limited as long as there's authority, statutory authority to be able to do it. Yeah, probably.
And generally, our regulations are just this board's interpretation of the broader language in statute.
Yeah, good point. If there are no other questions, I do have one question confirmation, if now's a good time. Audra and Rob, if you could speak to this a little bit. As we all know, there's recent change in state law dealing with the implementation, at least primarily dealing with the implementation of any employer contribution rate increases. And my non-attorney thought and interpretation is that really doesn't change our fiduciary duty at all. Basically everything else and the duties and roles of the board and staff, with the exception of that change, still remain the same in administering the plan, in carrying out all of our responsibilities. As it relates to the employer contribution rate, Previously, when the board would act, it would actually implement the employer contribution rate. Now, the board's role would be to recommend, but the duty to implement it would be solely with the legislature. Then that's essentially the only change as far as board duties. Instead of it actually going into effect, it's just a recommendation. And I don't think that changes our fiduciary role, and certainly not in a material sense. But I wanted to confirm that or ask that of all of you, Rob and Audra, and let you comment on that, either to confirm or correct or advise otherwise.
Rob, you want to go first this time? Okay.
Oh, sure.
Yeah, go ahead.
All right. No, Ray, Mr. Higgins, you're absolutely correct that you still have a fiduciary duty to measure the employer contribution rate. And now under the law, as it's been changed, you have additional requirements that have been put on you by the plan sponsor if you're going to make a recommendation.
Thank you.
I do have just one last thing in response to some of the earlier discussion, which Mr. Higgins plans to talk later about what we're recommending to the legislature. But the new law, the new bill, sorry, Dr. McCoy, the new legislation from last year still left the authority to hire actuaries to examine the plan and make those recommendations to the legislature, to the settler, still with this board. So while you can't just set the rate as previously was written in the law, you still are making these recommendations, and whether or not the settler follows your recommendations, that's a different discussion. But your role is to do your, stay loyal, of course, to the trust, as they've said, and be prudent in your decision-making in the processes of those decisions. It's not necessarily just what the decision is, but how you got there, and doing your due diligence, if you will, throughout that process, and making those recommendations, and where they go from there. This board acts through its minutes. So you put those decisions in writing here, you deliver those decisions to the legislature, and what they do with them, that's a different role. That help a little bit?
That's good. I mean, that's the way I understand it to work now, yes.
There's statutory language that says that it shall be an obligation of the state. So if there's no money, it shall be appropriated is actually